And I'm going to point it back toward Big Ten Media Days and anything else that you've gathered that really stands out to you in terms of the mindset of this team and of Ryan Day as they hit camp.
It's funny because having covered the team all off season, going back to coming out of the Cotton Bowl and the disappointment that was that loss to Missouri, the tone at media days and the tone the first time we talked to any players, the beginning of the offseason, really hasn't changed. The players that came back have done so for a reason. There is a clear understanding that this team believes that they can win a national championship this year. And while in the past, there have been talented Ohio State teams that have kind of shied away from that and, didn't want to put too much expectations on the players, on the staff, despite what those of us in the media were saying, what fans expected. They are leaning into that in a big way. And, we knew that, but I think the rest of the Big Ten, even the rest of the country, maybe got a good perspective of that at Big Ten Media Days. Ryan Day on the podium basically saying, there's still work to be done, but we know what this team is capable of. Players reiterating that message as well. When we spoke to them, they sent 3 seniors to Big Ten Media Day: Emeka Egbuka, Denzel Burke, and Jack Sawyer, all guys who made the decision to come back because they felt there was unfinished business. So they're not backing away from these expectations. And, I asked some of the guys about, what you want to have at the end of the season, and that's lifting that national championship. You want to win the Big Ten. You want to beat Michigan. But you got to get there first, right? You got to get through fall camp. You got to get through the non-conference slate, which is not an exciting one. You don't play Oregon, the first real big game of the season, until October. How do you make every game as big as some of those other games? And that was kind of the question I had going in. Denzel Burke gave me an answer that, look, it has to be every game is a national championship game in our minds. And I think there's still some challenges to do that when you're playing a team like, an Akron. No offense to Akron, but that's not Michigan. That's not a college football playoff opponent. And Emeka Egbuka told me, well, if we don't beat Akron, a lot of those other games aren't going to matter, right? So I think it's going to be an interesting thing to follow throughout fall camp and the start of this season, kind of how they stay fully motivated as, kind of the grind of camp, the grind of the season starts to take place. But no doubt this team expects to be national championships at the end of the season. And look, the talent is there, but it's about doing all the other little things and having some things go your way, right?
Pat, the entire offseason, I've been weighing this expectation load, and I go back and forth because on one hand, and I think I've finally figured it out, because on one hand, I think ever since Jim Tressel pretty much got this thing rolling 20 years ago, isn't this team ranked in the preseason top 5 every year? like what's the difference this year? Okay, they're 2 1 year, they're 3 1 year, they're 4, they're 2. That's where they've lived for this entire time. So there's that. And the players said that a number of times. Okay, we're at Ohio State. We're gunning for a national championship every year. On the other hand, then I put together, okay, the 3-game losing streak to Michigan. These guys could have went to the NFL. They decided to come back, and the big splash that never existed before, free agency in college football and acquiring all this talent. And it looks like, okay, we're gunning for this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of echoed what Ryan Day has tried to say throughout the offseason of, look, we're at Ohio State. The expectations are always that we win every game, beat Michigan, win the Big Ten, and compete for a national championship. And I think he's right. And he understands what's at stake here, but I also understand why he publicly is saying the things that he is. I think the difference, however, is what some of the players have said. And it started with Denzel Burke. I think it was in mid-March when we talked to a lot of the returning guys, and he came out and said, natty or bust. And that's kind of been the mantra of this team. Yes, they are always talented. They always have, top recruiting classes and are highly ranked. But I just think that this year feels different because of, like you mentioned, 12 guys that could have gone to the NFL and probably been decently highly drafted. Obviously, each of them have their own reasons for coming back, and the draft is probably part of that. But I go back to Burke again. He said he got a late first, early second round grade from the pre-draft process. I think in most other years, if they had gone 2-1 against Michigan, maybe made it to a national championship final or national championship game, won a couple Big Tens, I think he's gone, right? But a player like that coming back, Jack Sawyer kind of leading the way as a Columbus product, talking to his classmates about, look, this is what this means for Ohio State fans, for the state of Ohio, for the city of Columbus, all this. And if we can come back and accomplish this, especially, let's not forget, on the heels of Michigan winning a national championship, sort of doing a similar thing with so many guys coming back. I think that's kind of where the difference is. And then you mentioned it too, and that was the other thing, the transfer portal. And not only, we've gotten used to the transfer portal, but Ohio State hasn't done what they did this offseason. And some of it had to do with Nick Saban retiring and the availability of a Caleb Downs, even Julian Sayin, who may not have an impact this year, but certainly in the future. But numbers-wise, Ohio State hasn't been a huge transfer portal team, but the players that they got and the guys that can come in and make an impact, Caleb Downs, Will Howard, potentially, assuming he wins the starting quarterback job. Seth McLaughlin could be the starting center and certainly is going to play somewhere on the offensive line if it's not there. Guys like that can come in and immediately play. Quinshon Judkins, when you already have Travion Henderson likely coming back, though he hadn't announced that publicly. So, yes, the difference is it feels like they've pushed all their chips to the middle of the table and are saying we're all in, and they're also saying that publicly. And I think that is where it's different from past seasons.
Denzel Burke in particular intrigues me. Here's this softly spoken individual, kind of like a Walter Payton type voice in a sense, but big vibrato comes out of him. And unless you're digging for player interviews, of course, you guys are, you in particular are used to talking to these guys, but we don't hear from them very often unless you're really digging for interviews. It's just a few times a year. And I don't know if he's got a chip on his shoulder. He has to know that people know he's good, but maybe in a sense, he sounds like he seems slighted and like he believes he's the best, and maybe he's not given quite that type of status out there.
Well, Denzel said he wants to leave this season knowing that, with everyone knowing that he's the best cornerback in college football. So he put it out there. Simple as that. Look, he had a great freshman season. I don't think a lot of people expected him to come in and start right away outside of Denzel Burke, but he did. Started week 1, started every game that season. His sophomore season was a bit of a dip. He dealt with some injuries. He talked last offseason about how it was the first time he dealt with major injuries, and mentally he just didn't know how to deal with that and was never able to respond. He then admitted at Big Ten Media Days that beyond that, he probably got a little complacent in the offseason before his sophomore year. Just a little bit of maturing needed to happen. And when he didn't perform up to the level he expected to, it kind of clicked for him. And you saw it last season. If you look at his statistics, nothing jumps out at you, but that's because quarterbacks weren't throwing his way because he was one of the better cornerbacks in the country. And then you had guys on the other side of the field like Davison Igbinosun and Jordan Hancock who could then make some plays. So I think Denzel recognizes if he put in the work this offseason, he could be one of the top DBs taken in the draft next year, and on all the other stuff we talked about, the chance to leave a legacy at Ohio State by, turning it around against Michigan, winning the Big Ten, and potentially winning a national championship. And so, I think all of the guys, frankly, whether you're Denzel Burke and you did have a decently high grade, or you're a guy like Jack Sawyer who hasn't had the career maybe he wanted to, or people thought he would, but did really start to come on the second half of last season, back playing full-time defensive end. They all want to win, and no doubt about that. But they also all have individual things that they could still improve on. Marvin Harrison Jr. could have come back, right? But he could have accomplished those team things. There's talk about the fact that he really considered it. But in the end, if you're the number 4 pick in the draft, you got to go, right? And so these guys that did come back still have more that they can earn in the eyes of the NFL.
Pat Murphy's here breaking down the Buckeyes. Training camp's just days away in Columbus. Catch Pat's work at Bucknuts 247 Sports. When officially is training camp?
Thursday morning is when we kick it all off. I believe we will be able to be there. That has been the word, though we haven't gotten in a full schedule yet. But Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday are the first 4 days. They are open to fans. I believe there's still tickets available, so fans actually can get a look. And then I think they'll take Monday off, is kind of what Ryan Day was saying, and then jump back into things that next week. But yeah, all kicks off the end of this week.
Let's grind on some personnel here. Maybe because he wanted to take some pressure off of Will Howard and the quarterbacks. I'm not discounting what Ryan Day said about the offensive line, but he almost put it on the offensive line at one point during Big Ten Media Days to say, this is the key to the season. We've got to get this figured out. We've got to improve there. The guard position was brought up in particular.
Yeah, this is the key to Ohio State season in my mind. And I think I've walked back from the ledge, for lack of a better phrase, kind of how panicky I think people should be about the offensive line. Going into the offseason, I think a lot of people expected, okay, the offensive line wasn't great in 2023. They'll probably go to the transfer portal and add a guy, right? That didn't happen. But what did happen is development. And I think, especially in this new transfer portal era, we often forget about that these guys can get better in the offseason, right? And so you look at a guy like Josh Simmons at left tackle. Well, he got better throughout the season. He came from San Diego State. You could tell at first that this was a lot for him to start at left tackle. He was a right tackle at San Diego State. As the season went on, he showed the potential, the promise of the player that they recruited out of the transfer portal. I thought by the end of the season, he was pretty good. Now you build on that in the offseason. You got to put in the work. It sounds like he has. A guy like Josh Fryer, right tackle, didn't have a great season last year, first year as a full-time starter. But all the talk is he has put in the work to transform his body, to be in better shape, to be able to do some more things. It sounds like he's going to hold on to that right tackle job, which is probably where I think most people thought they would go to get a transfer portal lineman. The center position is technically still up for grabs. Ryan Day said during Big Ten Media Days, Carson Hinsman and Seth McLaughlin are still competing for that. But Seth McLaughlin started the spring game. He was the guy they brought in from Alabama. In my estimation, and from everything I understand, the plan is, unless something crazy happens during fall camp, that Seth McLaughlin will start at center. And then you've got the right guard spot that's still up for grabs in terms of Carson Hinsman, Luke Montgomery, Tegra Shabola. That'll be settled in camp. I didn't mention the left guard. That's Donovan Jackson. He'll be back for his third year as a starter. No concerns there. So look, if Ohio State gets the right side of that offensive line down, you're in a pretty good spot. And let's not forget, with the offensive line the team had a year ago, you're probably one snap where Donovan Jackson trips over Carson Hinsman's foot and Kyle McCord's throw to Marvin Harrison Jr. is off target. If that goes as planned instead of the trip there, we're probably talking about the Buckeyes as the national champions, or at least going to the college football playoff after winning the Big Ten championship, because I feel like they finished that drive against Michigan. So yes, this offensive line has room to improve, but they were able to figure out ways to still win games as a team to get that close. And those are the margins in college football. And that's why I think when you talk natty or bust, like little tiny things can change the course of a season. And, that's why teams tend to hesitate to go all in the way Ohio State has. But they were close. So if you can improve some things on the offensive line, and it sounds, at least they believe that has happened this offseason, and you find that right guard that fits in, you're in a pretty good spot. Now, you still have to do that. All that has to happen, and that's where I think the questions still remain. And we're not going to know that really until a couple weeks into camp when pads go on, and frankly, not until probably a few weeks into the season when Ohio State starts Big Ten play and goes to Michigan State and hosts Iowa, and really then when they go out to Oregon in October, when we're going to really see if this offensive line is what they hope it will be.
Pat, it's become one of my go-to lines to deflect the culture problem questions that I field in comments about Ohio State having a culture problem. And I've said, no excuses. They didn't make the plays, didn't get it done. However, they were at the 35-yard line to end the season on the road at Michigan. and they were that close, whether you look at a mistake or two, like you just mentioned, or one pass completion away from being the number one seed undefeated team in the playoff. And if they've got culture problems, then they must be the most talented team in college football history to work through culture problems and just kind of throw out a 50% effort and still be that close to being the number one seed in the playoffs. So,
yeah. Well, and look, you're Ohio State. This is, the New York Yankees, the Dallas Cowboys. Pick your team that not only has historically been great, but has been great somewhat recently, and continues to be close, right? So you're going to get the standard is what it is. And I think the Buckeyes would all tell you that. The people inside the building at the Woody Hayes, they understand that fact. So when you're close, you didn't reach it, right? And that's just frankly what it is. Now, if we're talking culture, when you don't reach your goals, people are going to look for answers, right? And those, Ryan Day himself has looked for answers. Why couldn't we finish that game? And it's not just on that. He didn't want to put it on one play. He talked about, could we have gotten stops earlier in the game, or could we have been more efficient earlier in the game to score so we didn't have to be in those positions? Fans are going to look for answers too, and they're not in the building. They're not rewatching every play, every snap. Most of them, maybe some of them are. I know some Buckeye fans who do go back and watch a lot. So I'm not saying everybody, but culture is an easy thing to throw out, especially when you were watching Michigan and the last few years, and they've talked about physicality and things in the trenches, and I get all of that. And if you're Ohio State, you have to prove it. Now, this Buckeye team did go to Notre Dame last year in what was one of the more physical games I've seen, standing on the sidelines in that fourth quarter, and found a way to win that one late, right? You don't win that game if you have a culture problem. Losing to Michigan, it's not necessarily a culture problem. You just lost to what ended up being the best team in the country on the road. And frankly, from an outside perspective, if you're looking at that rivalry and you want that rivalry to be at its best, the home team is going to just sometimes win because they're the home team. And I'm not saying that's what happened with Michigan, but Ohio State was still one of the better teams in the country last season. And I think, too, the Cotton Bowl kind of affects the perception, right? Obviously, losing to Michigan, not making the Big Ten championship game, not making the college football playoff was always going to put a damper on what you were going to do heading into the offseason. But if you go out in the Cotton Bowl and look like the Buckeyes did most of the season, okay, fine. You have a better feeling going into the offseason. But Kyle McCord transfers, and Ohio State decides to try to tinker with the offensive line. Then Devin Brown gets hurt early in the first quarter, comes out of the game in the second quarter, and now you're playing with the freshman quarterback who's clearly not prepared. And so the game is ugly. It's boring. And then the defense, despite holding Missouri off the board for 3 quarters, just finally the dam breaks and they can't do it anymore. And so you go into the offseason feeling like, 2 losses in a row again for the second straight year. And I can see why people point to the culture. But having been around this program throughout the offseason, we're over there all throughout spring. We're there during the summer when they're having recruiting camps and coaches are around. You're talking to players. I don't see a culture problem. If there's a culture problem, I don't think 12 juniors elect to come back, frankly. If they wanted to finish their careers somewhere, they could have gone elsewhere in the transfer portal. Can it be better? Absolutely. Unless you win the national championship and go undefeated, there are always things that can improve. I'm not saying that, but I do think that the culture is right. It's just about getting over that hump, and it's not easy. It's just simply not. That's why one team each conference lifts a trophy at the end of the year, and then one team lifts the national championship. It's tough to get to that point, and that's not an excuse for Ohio State. The Buckeyes need to get it done.
Ohio State enters this season with a quarterback that has a proven track record, and they have certainly competed for national championships with quarterbacks who had never thrown a pass or who had limited time, like a Justin Fields, to rate where they stood. But Will Howard at least has a very high floor, if nothing else. We know that he's a dependable quarterback. Do you think it's just a matter of getting him ready for the season, or if there is a legitimate quarterback competition?
I would say it's somewhere in the middle. I think you do need to get him ready for the season. Like I said with Seth McLaughlin, you don't bring a guy like that to Columbus, to Ohio State, without the expectation that he will be your starter. But you also don't just give anyone the job. You want them to compete, and they've got to show it. And I don't think Will Howard did that in spring. we've talked to Will Howard a couple times now, and he admitted partway through spring practice that it was not as easy as a transition as maybe he thought, just because, you're uprooting your life and moving everything and all that comes with that. But also you are going from a Kansas State offense with Kansas State athletes. And again, I'm not trying to slight Kansas State, but Will Howard's top pass catcher last year was his tight end. Now you're throwing to guys like Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith, Brandon Inniss. I mean, it speeds up everything, the rush speeds up, all of that. And so it took him some time to settle in and get comfortable with everything that was happening around him and getting the ball to these guys on time and things like that, getting used to his teammates and the offense. And I think by the end of spring, you started to see the Will Howard that the Buckeyes wanted out of the transfer portal. He was, in the spring game, think of that, efficient passing, still maybe not the downfield passer you would have liked, but getting the ball out to his weapons, using his legs, which I think will be big. And that experience, when you get into some of those games, Oregon on the road, Penn State on the road, he's been in big time battles, right? He had to basically carry Kansas State to the Big 12 championship game a few years ago, in the Big 12 championship game a few years ago. So he knows how to get the job done. This will be the most talent he's ever had around him. And, how he uses it, we'll see. But that is the belief in Will Howard. Now, Devin Brown, despite never being able to show it to fans because of injuries and whatnot, is also a quarterback that the Buckeyes like. And look, if Devin Brown had stayed healthy and had a good Cotton Bowl, I think he goes into the offseason as the quarterback, and you don't even necessarily go to the transfer portal. Maybe Ohio State still brings in, a Julian Sayin because he becomes available, but you're not necessarily going out to find another starter because Devin Brown's going to be your guy. So I do think that there is a competition to be had during fall camp. If Will Howard doesn't build on the way he finished spring, then Devin Brown's going to have an opportunity to win that job. But if I'm looking in my crystal ball, I think you look to August 31st and that opening a game against Akron, Will Howard's your quarterback unless something crazy happens.
Pat Murphy's here breaking down the Buckeyes. Catch Pat's work on Bucknuts 247 Sports. Ryan Day made a comment during Big Ten Media Days about and would not just about every team in college football like to have this problem, figuring out the 5, 6, and 7 slots at wide receiver. Just your thoughts about it's an extremely, once again, loaded room. However, after Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate certainly got comfortable, caught, I believe, 18 passes last year, but a lot of just extremely talented guys that have not produced on the college level, whether they've had a chance or not. And I know that everybody's jaws dropped in regards to being asked the question about Jeremiah Smith. Jack Sawyer in particular was like, I was thinking this guy's got a lot of pressure on him. I hope he comes in and just feels like he doesn't need to prove anything. He can be comfortable, break himself in for a year. And then he saw him on the field and he was like, holy, this guy can play now.
Yeah, the wide receiver room is interesting because it takes me back to a few years ago when you had Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka kind of coming up. You'd seen them play some. Obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr. had the big Rose Bowl. You had Jackson Smith coming back kind of in that Emeka Egbuka role. He obviously gets hurt, so you don't end up having him. But at this point in that, heading into fall camp, we thought, okay, we've got a veteran receiver, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and then we've got these young guys that we believe in, right? The difference, I think, now is that Ohio State, if all goes to plan, wants to play 16 or 17 games. All offseason, we've heard depth. We're going to have to play depth. Every position, we're going to have to play depth. Well, as you mentioned, yes, you've got Emeka. You've got Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith. Brandon Inniss, I'd throw in that in that group too. But then if you want to play depth, not a lot behind them. Bryson Rogers, veteran Jaden Ballard, Kojo Antwi. None of those guys have done much in college football. And that's what Ryan Day was talking about, was they need those guys to step up and be, guys that they can trust to step on the field, not have a big drop off, and can make plays, because they're going to have to rotate more at wide receiver or pull guys out maybe earlier than they would have, because they want guys healthy when it matters most in those big games and at the end of the season. we've seen injuries. Emeka Egbuka last season missed 3 games mid-season, doesn't ever really rebound from that. You're trying to avoid those things. Injuries are going to happen, but you're trying to stay as fresh as possible, have as much depth as possible. And then, even a Carnell Tate, a Brandon Inniss, a Jeremiah Smith, those guys still have things to prove, right? You mentioned Brandon Inniss, or you mentioned Carnell Tate's 18 catches. That's only 18 catches. I'm trying to pull the numbers up here because I did a story on it recently. The combination of, or the number of receptions behind Emeka Egbuka, I want to say is like 24, 25. If I can find that number, I'll spit it out here. But it is not high, and so those guys have to show up and produce in fall camp. 29 returning receptions between the team after Emeka Egbuka. So those guys still have to show up. They have to make plays in fall camp to show that they deserve to be on the field and can make the plays necessary once the lights come on and the season begins at the end of this month.
And before we let you go, Pat, on defense, it seems to be pretty airtight in regards to assignments. But are there any key backup positions or situations where you think somebody has an opportunity to show something to gain some playing time?
Yeah, I think you can point to a number of different spots. I think, we'll start up front with the defensive line. We know Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimalau, the defensive ends, but again, they're going to need to rotate. They're going to need depth. Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson are the known names, but production hasn't been there. There's a reason Ohio State hasn't rotated a ton at defensive end. Can they, both those guys going into their third year, really start to give confidence that you can take out the starting defensive ends at times and don't have a drop off? Think back to, when Ohio State was really rolling at that position and kind of how Larry Johnson rotated guys in. Same on the interior. You've got Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams. Where's the depth behind them? Who will those guys be? There's names. Hero Kanu had some moments last year. Tywone Malone came over from Ole Miss and didn't play a ton last season. So, can guys emerge as, factors in the rotation there? At linebacker, they still need to find a weak side linebacker. It's probably going to be one of CJ Hicks or Sonny Styles, but those guys still have to earn it. Behind them, you're going to need depth. Gabe Powers is a guy to consider. Arvell Reese, a name to know. But again, all of these guys have to continue to prove it. They had good springs, most of them, which is why we're talking about them. But, you have to carry it over. I think at cornerback, you've got a very deep room. You've got your 3 starters in Denzel Burke, Davison Igbinosun, and Jordan Hancock. But then behind them, you've got guys like Jermaine Matthews Jr., who started the Penn State game for Burke last year when he was hurt. Calvin Simpson-Hunt, who was the higher ranked of the two in the 2023 recruiting class, but enrolled in the summer, so didn't play much as a true freshman. They have an embarrassment of riches at cornerback and will be fine at that spot. But, guys still have to, I just keep repeating it, guys have to develop. At safety, you got Lathan Ransom back to go with Caleb Downs. Guys behind them, not a lot of experience. It's kind of similar to receiver there in terms of the players who, can step in, names that Buckeye fans will recognize, but not necessarily names that are all that experienced. Jaden Bonsu was a guy who had a good spring playing well. Lathan Ransom was kind of slowly brought back from his injury last year. Malik Hartford was a guy that last season had a lot of buzz coming into the year, didn't really play a ton after starting the second game of the season, but had a good offseason by all accounts. They brought in Nelson Jr. from South Carolina to add some depth as well. So, there are guys there. Just got to show the depth, and make plays in fall camp. And that's really what I think most of fall camp is going to be about. You are establishing other than quarterback, offensive line, linebacker, you're pretty much set, right? So it's about finding those next guys and then getting, obviously, the starters ready for the season.
Real quick, Pat, I also wanted to hit you up on running back because obviously you got the 2 stars in place, but Ryan Day has said throughout the offseason, 16 or 17 game season, hopefully keep those guys fresh. Buckeyes should win a handful of games by pick your score. So how do you think it plays out as the third back that gets those carries, or we don't want to see an injury, becomes the number 2 back at some point?
Yeah. So beyond Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson, who I think will essentially call co-starters, I don't think it matters who takes the first snap each week. They're both going to play a lot. You are lacking in depth. When Dallin Hayden and went to Kentucky,
Evan Pryor left. Well,
Chip
Tranum. Yeah.
Yes, Evan Pryor also. Those guys leaves some holes on the depth chart, right? And so Ohio State's going to have 2 freshmen in James Peoples and Sam Williams-Dixon that will be 3rd and 4th on the depth chart. They did have TC Caffey, who is a walk-on who at some point I imagine will be put on scholarship. He was coming back from a knee injury that cost him most of 2 seasons ago, well, half of 2 seasons ago and all of last season. Then he suffers another knee injury during summer workouts. So not a guy who's probably was going to play a ton, but was probably going to get some snaps, can carry the ball, can do some things. So that's certainly a blow to the depth. The Buckeyes sort of kick the tires at points on bringing in a transfer portal running back, but how do you convince a guy to come in and be behind Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson? It's hard to do in the transfer portal. You'd probably have to find a guy who just really loves Ohio State and is willing to, sit for a year maybe or 2. But they do like James Peoples. They do like Sam Williams-Dixon. We'll see where Sam Williams-Dixon ends up in his career. The comparison has been made to Curtis Samuel, who started as a running back up to Ezekiel Elliott and then eventually ended his career as a wide receiver. And that's where he's been in the NFL. But certainly for this year, he will be at running back. James Peoples is a guy they like a lot. Looked good, I thought, in the spring game. And then Ryan Day talked about, maybe having some other guys in an emergency situation available to carry the ball. Obviously, he made headlines this offseason when he suggested that Caleb Downs could do some running back stuff. We'll see. I'm still just not convinced that you're going to risk that for a guy that you need on the back end of your defense. We talked about the safety depth. It's not great. So I don't know if you realistically put Caleb Downs back there unless you absolutely have to. But Brian Day mentioned Emeka Egbuka's carried the ball. That's been on like some jet sweep stuff, but he could take a handoff or 2 if you needed him to. Brandon Inniss, another guy that Ryan Day referenced. So you hope, like you said, Mark, you don't get to that point where you're having to put wide receivers in the backfield, but the depth is not as great as they would like it. Yes, you have 2 of the most talented running backs in the country up at the top of the depth chart, but if there are injuries there, it could get a little dicey in the backfield.
Pat Murphy setting us up for training camp. Join Pat on Bucknuts 247 Sports. The Buckeyes hit the practice field on Thursday. Pat, I'm smarter now, so thanks for being here, and we appreciate it.
Absolutely, Mark. I appreciate you having me on the first live show.